pleased to welcome you to our workshop, Tips for Creating a Successful Proposal Budget. And very happy to have with us Michelle Francis, who is the Program Manager at FSU's Southwest Research Administration, who will be walking us through this. Michelle Francis, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I want to kind of preface this presentation a little bit. I'm going to be going over the tips of creating a proposal budget prior to what you need to do to get it into FSU's ramp system of the proposal. So where to find information, what's needed, how you find that information, and what's required for budgets. It's kind of a high overview look at everything. There's not going to be any like how-tos on entering it into the proposal system of ramp or going into individual line items, but it's going to be more of a getting all your information together up front so that you're ready to proceed with your budget. So we'll go ahead and get started. One of the biggest things I've learned when doing budgets is learning to plan early with your budgets. Budgets can be very scary. You think, oh my gosh, there's this large budget I have to prepare and I don't know what to do. But starting the process early can help eliminate some of those fears. Some proposal budgets are very straightforward. They tell you exactly what you're allowed to budget for and the amount you're allowed to, the total amount you're allowed to have. Some of them are very complex. And some of them will say, here's an amount you can propose and tell me what you need. So, it's kind of knowing what all you need to put into the budget to make sure that once it gets ready to be entered into the ramp system and be reviewed by our central offices and the awarding agency, that everything has been addressed and covered and it's very clear and concise and detailed what exactly everything that you need. When you're looking to prepare a budget, the most important thing is the who, what, when, where, and why of a budget. And I'm going to go into more detail of that in a couple slides down. Another major component of it is the funding announcement. Funding announcements, solicitations, there's multiple names for them, but these are the documents that are provided from funding agencies on the guidelines for the proposal. What's needed in the budget, what's needed for the technical components, every document, down to bio sketches. We're only going to really focus with the funding announcements based on what's needed for a budget. But there are other details that go in there. And then lastly, I'm going to show you a way that I use to organize my budget and the budget details that are needed. So that way I'm prepared to enter the information into ramp. One thing that's very important about planning early is the FSU submission proposal policy. All completed proposals are due into the central office, either sponsored research or the FSU Research Foundation, 3 working days prior to the due date. There is a policy on it. There is a link that'll be, I will provide that information later on in a resource that you guys can have. But the policy is very straightforward, and they have this policy so that they can ensure that their central office staff can review the information that's needed in the proposal, compare it to the guidelines and the funding announcement, and make sure it meets the funding agency's requirements as well as FSU's. Now, this 3-day window is the last day to get things in, the completed proposal. It is suggested to try to get this information in earlier so that there is ample time to review everything, make sure everything is there, and if there's any corrections, you're not trying to do it in the last minute. But once again, this kind of goes into the planning early. As soon as you know about a proposal, and when I say know about a proposal, it depends on your role in the proposal process. If you're a PI and you find a funding announcement that you want to submit a proposal to, letting your department staff know, if you have department staff that help you manage the operation of the proposal, getting the documents together and submitting it through ramp for you. Or if you're a PI and you do it yourself and you don't have the department help, letting your deans and chairs know that you're thinking about doing this. And also letting the central office know. Central office is letting them know ahead of time that there's a potential for a proposal They can put it on their calendar, especially with agencies that have big reporting dates. NIH is one of them. They have set dates for certain proposals based on the type of proposal it is. So it's all these items right here are part of planning early and making sure that you kind of have everything ahead of time and making sure all your documents are straight. The who, what, when, where, and why. I use these as kind of like my my guide. When I'm get a request to help with a proposal budget and help a PI get it together, I have my own little list of these items. The who part is who's going to needed to complete this project. The senior and key personnel or PIs, co-Is, co-PIs. There's other personnel that are, FSU employees that are graduate students and postdocs and undergraduate students. All of these people have some sort of role in the project, and so therefore they have to be listed in the budget for their salary. There are other types of personnel needed on projects. Sometimes they're listed in the funding announcement that they need certain types. Sometimes whatever the project is, you need additional ones, but that's something to kind of have down on the list of who will be needed to complete this project. The other item is what is needed to complete the scope of work. The scope of work is what the UPI will have of what the project's about. Items that can be included are equipment, travel, other direct costs that are included like tuition, materials and supplies, publications. If the PI is going to be using somebody from another university or another entity, they may need a subaward, contractors, and other things like that. But these are items that you would need to, like I said, I have on my little checklist to ask the PI is, are we going to have these on this proposal? Other items is the when and the where of the proposal. The when is how long the project is going, how long it's going to take the PI to perform the work. Most times this is dictated by what's in the funding proposal announcement. They will say how long they're allowing the funding period to be. So, but there has to be a start and an end date of a project. And that way you line items per year of how your money is going to be spent. The where, there's two components of the where. Is it going to be performed on or off campus? And the reasonings for that are the main reason is determining what type of indirect cost rate will be used. Their indirect cost rates are, in very general layman terms, are the funds that are used for general office, making a building work. For example, the College of Medicine, if you're doing a research project in the College of Medicine, the money that's collected from the indirect costs will help with the building that you're going to be using to do that research. It's not something extra. So, but that's something when you're looking at the proposal, is it going to be something that happens on campus or is it going to be something that happens off of campus? Also, the where includes the travel component, knowing whether or not there is required travel for the PI or co-PIs to take or co-Is to take. And the last part of the W's is the why. The why is the budget justification. The budget justification explains the expenses that are necessary to perform the work. This is a very important aspect of the budget because that will explain how everything is going to be spent. And that is what is used to make sure that the expenses that are on there are allowed by the agency and or FSU. So I kind of touched a little bit about the funding announcements. The funding announcements are very important. Unfortunately, sometimes the funding announcements are not very straightforward. When you're looking to find out what budget requirements are allowed on a proposal, sometimes they have a very clear header budget, list out what the total amount of money that you're going to be allowed to budget for a proposal. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have to go look at a proposal guide. For example, NSF and NIH, they have very detailed proposal guides on what they're looking for when a proposal is being submitted, and they have very specific details. NSF, honestly, they have page limit guidelines on different items. So that necessarily won't be in the funding announcement, but they will reference that in their in the funding announcements to look at that guide. The funding announcements will have the funding limit, how many dollars are going to be available. It also has the period of funding and how long you're going to be able to spend that money. The other thing that's really important to look in the funding announcement are budget items that are that are not allowed or excluded. It's not necessarily that they're not allowed in general. It's just for some reason on that that agency won't allow the funding. For example, sometimes they won't allow tuition. NSF doesn't allow cost share. So there's certain things that agencies will limit of what is allowed in a budget. Sometimes they will limit the amount of salary a PI can request. I'll use NSF again as an example. They only allow for 2 summer months of salary, whereas NIH doesn't really have that restriction, but they have a restriction of salary caps. If you make over a certain amount of annual salary, you can only budget their salary cap amount. So these are very important items to look at and to notate on your list that you're going to make for knowing what you're allowed to put into your budget. So sometimes they will list them that you can't do any. They'll have some types of travel restrictions where you're only allowed to travel in state. Sometimes they won't allow out of country or foreign travel. So like I said, it's just very important to, when looking at the funding announcements, to know where all the information is and to know what they allow and what they're looking for. Because some agencies, if you include something that is not permitted on there within the funding announcement that they gave you, they'll automatically reject it. So it's, like I said, it's very good to kind of go through and read the funding announcement and find the information that is needed. These funding announcements can be very lengthy, especially the federal ones. Private entities generally are not, but sometimes they can be. And sometimes some private entities will say, I want you to use the guidelines set out by NSF or NIH. And so then you have to go look at their guidelines, their proposal guidelines, to see what they allow. If you're looking to do a proposal and you're like, okay, I have to do this budget and I need to find out salaries and how much things cost, how do I find this information? So we're going to kind of take a little step into the organization process of getting your budget, which includes finding that pertinent information. I kind of mentioned the checklist. I always make some sort of list for myself. I know some people don't work that well that way. I do. I seem to find it useful to make my little list. I can check it off. I'm kind of using some of my experiences as an example, but when I've had a PI say that they're going to be submitting to a funding announcement, I go through and I make my list of, okay, who are you going to have on this? How many grad students, how many postdocs? And I email a list of everything that's on there. And I also include the information I found on the solicitation as well, or the funding announcement, and say, this is what is allowed, this is not. Oh, we have a salary cap here, or we have this. So they can kind of have an idea of what's going on. We, as of last July, almost a year now, FSU implemented a new proposal routing system called RAMP, which has changed how budgets have been developed. I've always used an Excel spreadsheet. There's actually still a budget workbook available on Sponsored Research's website, which is a very useful tool. It is a very useful tool to help you understand what needs to be entered into RAMP. RAMP is also very useful as well. And there are, at the bottom of the slide, there's a how-to, which will be in the resources we'll send out later on the how-to guides to creating a proposal in RAMP, and also the budget workbook. What it doesn't really do is tell you how much or how to find the prices of that. These are just kind of tools to put in the dollar amounts that you have. This is all kind of a, what do you do before you have to go and enter this information in for it to be seen by PIs and everybody and the others that have to approve. When looking at the cost for your personnel, the people that are going to be doing the work on the proposal, Most of for the salary positions for the PI, that information is available on Omni. Most faculty know what their salary is. The PI is responsible for notifying you of the amount of effort or how much salary they're going to request for that proposal. And that does get a little tricky at times, but it's basically they know their effort, they know what they're going to be able to do. The budget workbook that I mentioned, it puts salary in based on pay periods, which is a little different. And then in RAMP, it does it by percentage. So this is something that when you go to enter in and creating the proposal, the RAMP how-to guides are very useful in showing you how to actually enter that amount in. When it comes to grad students and postdocs and undergraduates, a PI may already have somebody in mind for it, especially a postdoc, but they may not have somebody specific. So they'll just leave it as that general term of what position it is. But their salaries are generally based on the department, and you should be able to contact your department rep who handles the HR component to find out what the average cost is for graduate students and postdocs and undergraduate. Now, some agencies do have suggestions. I know NIH is one of those. They do have kind of a range of salaries of what is anticipated for different positions, especially if it's not one of these that are listed. With these positions right here, especially with them being on FSU employees, there are other things that are counted into their salary outside of just the actual pay period salary. They have fringe benefits. They have insurance, which sounds very overwhelming and very a little confusing at times, but the SRA workbook that's available has that information available for you to on the spreadsheet to select. Another tool that has that information listed is the FSU fact sheet, but it breaks down the fringe rates and what is allowed on the budget. And it also breaks down the health insurance. This is for the key personnel. And for postdocs, graduate students do not get the health insurance, but they do get a health subsidy, a stipend on that. And the prices are listed there. These are all very important items that have to be included in a budget. This is a sample of the workbook that SRA has available to use as a tool. This is not how you submit your budget to sponsored research. This is just a tool that some departments have used to work with the PI to go back and forth to make sure that the amount of funding is available for that they're using the right amount of funding. And so when I mentioned that they have the fringe rates, they have them here. It's a drop box, and all of the current fringe rates are already listed in here. So it takes some of the calculation and the math portion of it out for you to where you can calculate it down. And it does it, as you notice, these are blank, but normally these are the senior personnel, which would be your PIs and your co-PIs. And then other personnel, that's where you would list in your grad students. There are times you will have other personnel that are not grad students. This form, like I said, as a tool, is a good tool to use to kind of help you determine what those roles are and what kind of fringe benefits and salaries they will have. And you can do it for as long as the budget period is for. And once again, like I said, it is a tool. It does have instructions for it. But it is something that if you've never prepared a budget before, it is something that is kind of helpful to use to kind of know how money is spent. To me, it's always been kind of a helpful resource for those that are new doing budgets and even those experienced ones that just kind of want to do a quick little check to see what the total cost will be. The one thing to remember when you're doing a budget, and it kind of goes into the other direct cost category of the what, is when you have a grad student, they automatically have tuition. You have to factor in tuition. And on the fact sheet, there is an explanation about what the tuition is. And when you come down to the other direct costs in this workbook, it will have in here the tuition. Now, granted, this is an old sample, so the cost of it is a little different, but this is just a sample that was done. And it will generate the tuition with the escalation that normally happens with tuition all the way through however many years on the project you have. So once again, it's kind of a useful tool to work a budget to make sure that you are meeting that funding requirement that's been set out by the funding agency. Now, when you get into the what's of the budget, most of this are costs or expenses that a lot of the faculty already kind of have an idea of. Some newer ones don't, but they have ways of they have resources of finding it out. So for example, if they're doing a project and they need a new piece of equipment, and the equipment definition is a non-expendable tangible item having a useful life of more than 1 year and costs more than $5,000. There is a line item specifically for that, because when you enter that information in, we don't actually charge indirect cost rate on that. So that's why that one's separated out. I mean, depending on the project, most people already have the equipment they need, but there are times when you need a specific incubator if you're doing something with animals that you need to have in order to do your project, that the faculty member will have that information. When it comes to travel, you may not know exactly where you're going. And when I say that, some funding announcements will say that the PI is required to attend a program management meeting once a year in DC. So doesn't give a time of year, doesn't give anything else than that. So you kind of have to do your best judgment call when it comes to travel for that. So most likely out of Tallahassee, you're going to have a flight. You're going to have hotel. You're going to have food costs. You're going to have miscellaneous, maybe taxis or things of that nature once you get there. Flights, most people will just kind of do an average of what a cost is as of, say, today, if they were doing it, and put that travel cost in for the flight. But there are certain items that we as FSU employees are required to do, and we have allotments or certain restrictions amount of money that we can spend on travel. And our travel office has a very useful travel reference guide on the travel procedures for FSU and for state employees. I have used this tool often. It kind of gives you a rundown of most of the important information, how you make charges, how things are expensed, mileage if you're using a personal vehicle, how to rent a vehicle. It also goes into the per diems and lodging and meals. Yes, unfortunately, as state employees, we do have a limit on the amount of money we're allowed to spend on hotel costs. And if you're doing international travel, there is one for international through the travel office. And at the end of this presentation, there is a link to the controller's office for that information. But as you can see, it does kind of spell things out. This is something that's very useful to have when you're trying to determine your travel costs. Now, keep in mind when you're doing the travel costs, when you're doing the travel, there's a lot of parts to that, which we're going to go into more detail when we get to the budget justification. But there has to be a purpose for this travel for this specific project. And that's something that we will, like I said, we'll address in a little bit when we get to the budget justification. Other parts like materials and supplies, once again, most PIs know the cost of what they're going to need for materials and supplies for their specific projects, even when it comes down to publication costs. The subaward and contractors, there is a specific form that has to be completed to determine whether it's a vendor or contractor, and that is available on Sponsored Research's website. Once again, there's a link on the resources for that. A subaward is a component that goes all the way back to the beginning when we talked about planning early. If a PI is planning on using somebody that is not an FSU employee, that's in another entity that's going to have a lot of information or going to have direct contact with the project, their work is going to determine things with the project, then there needs to be a subaward. And basically everything that we have talked about with budgets, this person has to do through their central office, as well as providing all their documents. And we have to have a commitment letter from that entity. So once again, going all the way back to planning early, if there is a subaward, that's why you want to, talk to your PI early about these projects to find out if there is one. So you can reach out to that person and say, okay, this is what we need from you, because we have to have this information to be part of our completed proposal that has to be submitted at no later than 3 days prior to the date it's due, date it's due to the entity. This is a part that can take some time because just like us, we have our own system of routing a proposal. They probably have theirs. So once again, part of that planning component, when you're making your little checklist and your little help guide of what you need to do, this is something that should be one of those very important items that is addressed very early. So that way it can be part of the proposal. So kind of going into the budget justification, because I kind of segued a little bit. When you're doing expenses and costs for a proposal, the costs have to be reasonable, knowing that it's a reasonable cost, knowing that it's something that is not inflated, which is kind of hard to know, but you don't want to overinflate something with the anticipation that maybe in 2 years it's going to be more. You have to do what the reasonable cost is of it now. Also, if it's allowable under the uniform guidance for federal projects or your applicable regulatory body, which is basically FSU. We're state employees. So we are also governed by state guidelines, by state guidelines. That's one of the reasons why we have that travel. With the travel, state employees are allowed X amount of dollars for hotel stay and so forth. So when looking at if something is allowable, those are two guides we have to look at, depending on the funding agency, and also whatever they allow too. Sometimes they have restrictions. So there's a lot to to look at. Most times, most projects are very straightforward. The budgets are, and the items are listed, and you go forward. The other thing with the budget justification is is allocable, are the costs directly assignable to the project. So what that means is basically if you have an incubator that you're using on project X, but you also want to use it on project Y, well, those projects have nothing to do with each other. So you're only allowed to use that incubator on that specific project, because that's where you have a lot of the money for. That's what you said you were using it for. So those are things to look for when you're explaining what you're using the funds for in your budget justification. So before we kind of go diving completely into the budget justification, kind of like recap a little bit about what you want to do with your proposal, with your budget. You want to create a checklist that includes the who, the what, the when, and the where of your project. You want to list out, what PIs, co-PIs, how many grad students, how many postdocs, what types of materials and supplies and other direct costs. And I typically list every single item out, even though it's not something we may use for this specific project. But I kind of have a template with it to help me make sure I don't miss something. I also then take that list and compare it to the funding announcement, to the budget, that's what they're allowing for the budget, and adding or excluding items. Or if they have, I've worked with one budget where admin, they had, the PI was only allowed certain amount of salary in their first year. The second year they could have this much salary. So, things of that nature that a PI, or yourself, if you're the PI doing it, that you need to remember when you're developing this budget to go forward. So now that when you get this information and you put it into either the Excel spreadsheet that the sponsor research has, or your own, or you have it in RAMP, you then look at how those items are listed, and then you work with your budget justification. The budget justification should outline all the expenses that are proposed on the project. Expenses should be in the same order as the budget details. So for example, you start with your PI, your co-PI, that's how it's listed in your budget. They should line up. So if someone has a picture of the budget and the justification, they can say, oh, the justification says this, and this is how much money they're spending. It makes it very easy to read. It makes it useful for the agency. Another thing that you have to be aware of when doing a budget justification is that some agencies have limits on how many pages a justification be. Sometimes they have specific information of what needs to be included, formatting issues. Some agencies may not say they need a budget justification, but FSU always requires you to have a budget justification for it so that we know to make sure that our costs are reasonable, allowable, and for FSU's guidelines. I'm going to pull up a sample justification so you can kind of see what one looks like for those that haven't. Like I said, this is just an example, but typically a budget justification it's a narrative of what money you're spending. So you basically have your title, your justification. Some agencies have formatting requirements where you have to include the agency's name, the salaries, and you kind of have to explain what the faculty is doing. It does not have to be very long, but it has to be to the point. It has to include what their appointment type is, how much salary they're requesting, how much time they're devoting, and if you're including any increase, like percent increase for raises and so forth. The same thing goes all the way down for the other personnel, any personnel listed. This example includes a piece of equipment. Now, in this example, we have purchase of science machine, but basically it says what the purpose is of the machine. Sometimes those are more detailed than others, but it does, it lists out what it's for. The travel part is what I really wanted to focus on, the justification. You can see in this example that they're requesting domestic travel. The travel's for 2 people to a domestic scientific conference in both years 2 and 3. And here's how the money was budgeted. You have to list, like if there's a registration fee for a conference, the lodging, and so forth all the way down. This has to be listed for each time there's travel. You have to say how the money is being used. And the same thing goes for international travel. Some departments have like a standard for a domestic trip, and that's what they use because, I mean, in all honesty, this is an estimate of what cost is going to be, especially if you're doing a budget today and the project may not start till January 1. The cost of flights or cost of renting a car, those types of things, those can all change. This is just a best assessment of what the cost will be. But it is required to have this information listed out for verification. Same thing that goes along with tuition. And there's standard language for tuition. This, like I said, is just kind of a mock-up, but there are some standard language for it. And the same thing with supplies. Some agencies require more detail on justifications. Some agencies have their own sheet that you need to fill out for your budget, and it includes the justification. So once again, going back to the funding announcement, it's very important to know how that agency wants that information presented. And the same thing with subawards. I'm just kind of scanning through real quick. You list in the total cost for the subawardee and everything else, and you have to list each one separately if there's more than one. And then they always have to reference the indirect cost rate. Now, you'll notice that there's not a lot of grand totals on this budget justification for each one. Some people include that, some don't. Some agencies require it. Like I said, it's pretty much, some people like to enter I personally enter the total amount so I can verify with what I have in my budget that everything is kind of meshing up, all the information, because in your budget, you just have a grand total. You don't normally have, especially with a travel, everything broken out. So it's kind of an extra checks and balance. Some agencies require at the bottom the total amount of the project that your total funds you're requesting and how it's broken out between direct cost and indirect cost. Once again, that could be an agency requirement, but it's something, going back to the planning ahead, is really looking at the funding announcement and knowing what it exactly they're looking for, know exactly what FSU is looking for when this proposal is being, submitted to central office for review and then on to the agency. There are some items on a budget that we do not include an indirect cost rate. So let me see if I can pull up my example again. I'm gonna write down here, this was a total direct cost budget. This was not an MDC, so let's just so for example, on a typical funding proposal, if you have a modified total direct indirect cost rate of 54%, your total direct cost is this, and this is what the indirect cost rate will be. So for example, because this sample budget has 2 subawards, the first $25,000 of it is not included. And so forth, let's see, what else do they have? Tuition. They have tuition on here, and they have equipment. So it's not necessarily a direct, that's where it's cut off at. It really does depend on what expenses are included in your budget. But once again, too, and the eSpirit trainings, which I'll put a link on the resource pages for that as well, it goes into how to do each one of these line items and how everything is calculated. And it does a very good job of answering those questions. There is another resource that has been created that was meant for research administrators, but also for anybody who is getting a proposal together. We do have a research administration manual. This was created to kind of be a first place to go to when doing anything with research administration, especially with preparing budgets, with any typical information that would involve any step of a proposal. What this does is it does allow for information that is needed in processing a full proposal. Once again, we're just focusing today on the budget, but there are items listed in here that go towards that, one of which is our training opportunities, which has a link to for eSpirit for SRA. This program would be very beneficial for those who are research administrators looking into doing proposals. But the one thing that they do offer on this eSpirit training is the building budgets. Building budgets goes into a very detailed hands-on. There's examples of this workbook as well as other workbooks or other aspects of putting the budget together once you have all the pertinent information that's needed. And then also too, which will also be in the resources page, is a link for the RAMP grants. RAMP grants, once again, we started with RAMP grants last year, and that is where all budgets are created to be submitted for proposals. There are how-to guides, there are steps in order to put that information in. Okay, so yeah, the indirect cost rate is always something that is very hard to explain. To me, it's always hard to explain verbally. It's sometimes easier to actually see. So and Holly, if you want, I would be happy to kind of walk you through this if you have an example. Basically, it's not, it sounds like it should be an automatic, oh, I take 54% off the top and be done. But so your question is, the total award you can get, your indirect cost shouldn't equal more than $46,000. And like I said, that's not necessarily the case, only because there are certain items that are excluded. And let me go back to this little workbook that I have, because this is always a question that's kind of hard to understand at times. I had a really hard time dealing with it when I first started. So for example, we're going to take this example because it's kind of a good one to go at. Down at the very bottom of the workbook, and this is the one thing I like about this workbook, is that it allows for you to put in how much money the funding agency is allowing. So if they're allowing, on this example, they're allowing only $300,000 total of for the whole thing, including your indirect costs. So for this budget, we're actually $19,000 over because our total with our indirect is this. So Holly, I would recommend kind of using this as a tool to kind of to work with, and putting in down here at the bottom, if you have $100,000 that you're allowed to spend, putting in every item that the PI has mentioned they want to do, and have it calculate the indirect cost rate, and then see where the money ends up. Because if you look here, this is not a quote 54 right on % of the total direct cost, because we have to use the modified direct total, which excludes any items that we do not charge indirect cost rate to, which would be tuition, subawards, and things like that. So does that help kind of visually see it a little bit? And like I said, I will be very happy if you want to get together, and I can walk you through how that works.
Michelle, we had a question. Someone is in a college that doesn't currently have someone to assist with grant development. Is there someone in SRA they can reach out to?
Normally you can talk to your grants officer. The grants officers, there's a list on SRA's website. I can actually pull that up real quick. Hopefully you guys can see the staff list. And they have their pre-award staff broken out by department, and you can contact them. Now, keep in mind, they're allowed to give you assistance on, what needs to be done and things like that. But when it comes to actually like developing the budget, because they're the ones that are reviewing the budget, generally they can give you advice on like when you've submitted a budget, what needs to be changed because it doesn't meet within requirements. They go through the solicitation. They can go through, I don't necessarily go through the solicitation, but you want to reach out to them and see what kind of help they can offer. But I would start with your grants officer.
So I got a private message that says this event seems tailored to scientists. What about those of us in the arts? And it seems like you're starting to talk about that. Those of us going for NEA, NEH. Do you have any of
and
those
that's students? The thing and the reason why I use NSF and NIH is because they typically have the most strict guidelines when it comes to submitting proposals. Most other agencies, they do not. Now, when it comes to submitting the proposal and getting the budget together, the process is the same no matter what entity or what agency you're submitting to. The only difference is who will be reviewing the project, who will be reviewing the proposal. If it's the private entities like the American Heart Association or any other of the outlets of that nature, or the private entities, that'll be going through FSU Research Foundation. But the proposal process and the budget preparation is the same regardless of what the entity is. Because basically, I have worked with somebody who was doing one in art therapy, and I've worked with a couple in music therapy. And yes, their components may be a little different than what the scientists are, but at the end of the concept behind it is the same. When it comes to preparing your budget, you have listed on there what you will need for your project. And same thing goes with their funding announcements. Sometimes those agencies are a little bit, they don't provide a lot of information. So sometimes there's a lot of correspondence you have to have back and forth between the program manager, sometimes even with your central office person to know what's allowed and what's not. Sometimes they've worked with that agency.
If someone's working with SRA, with an SRA representative, that 3-day window is still really important to keep in mind, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if you're doing with SRA or if you're doing with the Research Foundation. Okay. It is very, very important. I can't even stress how important it is to make sure that when you decide to do a proposal and to submit to an agency, to look at when the proposal is due, and giving yourself enough time between having it in no later than 3 days prior to that deadline date for the central office, but making sure you allot enough time for yourself to prepare not only the budget, which to me does take a lot of time because there are a lot of moving parts to it, but you also have to make sure that every other component of that proposal that's required by the funding agency is also complete and given to sponsored research or research foundation by that window as well. So I've, like I said, I have learned by mistake on my own part. I will admit there have been times I'm like, oh, we can get this done, and last minute things pop up with the proposal, or you're not getting information from whatever person you need to have for like a sub-award. That's why, like I said, it is the day you even think about doing a proposal, or your PI does, or you're a grad student and you're looking to do a proposal and your PI is going to be your mentor on it. Just look at when the deadline is and make sure you allot yourself ample time to make sure all of it is done. Because the last thing you want to do is spend all this time preparing everything, and then you've missed a major component and you're not able to submit it, and you missed the deadline. Or you submit it with the errors and they come back and say no. I mean, so like I said, it's the planning part of it probably is the making sure you give yourself enough time to do it. To me, a successful proposal is one that has met the guidelines of the agency, not necessarily that it's been awarded, but you've met every guideline that FSU has and the agency has in order to get it submitted. So that's my definition of a successful proposal.
That's really helpful to know that even though SRA and the Research Foundation are there to help double check things, don't rely on them to make your budget for you. Start using the tools that you've shared to put together something and start thinking about, so that you're that much further along once you get to SRA or the foundation.
And I know that ORD is working on having somebody that people can have questions to, but while you guys are still in that process, I know I'm able to help maybe even bounce some questions off of at least directing people to the right step, I guess. I can't really help develop everybody's budget in depth by any means, but if you're having a hard time finding some information, maybe, it's always nice to be able to have somebody you might be able to reach out to see if they have the answer to where you can go find that. I'm an advocate for helping out when it comes to this, because I know how important getting the proposals is, and I know how frustrating and sometimes stressful creating a budget can be. I have, found little tricks to the trades that have really been successful for me, and would love to be able to help others so that they don't feel like, oh my gosh, I have to create a budget, and it just causes panic and fear. Because if you, like I said, if you set out a simple path for yourself, a simple little checklist to make sure you have all that stuff off, it actually becomes very easy to a point. The math side of it can be handled through either the SRA workbook or even in RAMP grant. So it's just making sure you get all the right points in.
Michelle, thank you so much for all of this wonderful information.
Oh, you're welcome, and I'm hope it's helpful. And like I said, I have been in that spot where you're not quite sure what to do. So it's always nice to be able to have somewhere to go.